welcome to All Right in Sin City, a podcast about writers and writing in the Windsor-Detroit region. Your podcasters today are
Irene Moore Davis, author, educator, and local historian.
Kim Conklin, Windsor-based writer and filmmaker.
And me, Sarah Jarvis, former bookseller, publishing rep, and literary festival chair.
Our featured guest today is RS Deeren. A native Thumbody, RS Deeren is an assistant professor of creative writing at Austin Peay State University in Clarksville, Tennessee. His research interests include contemporary fiction, U.S. working class studies, and rural-urban dynamics. His fiction, nonfiction, and poetry have appeared in periodicals including the Great Lakes Review, Joyland, Midwestern Gothic, and more. Like some of his characters, he has also worked as a line cook, landscaper, lumberjack, and a bank teller. He received his Ph.D. at the University of Wisconsin-Milwaukee. His debut story collection, Enough to Lose, was selected as a Michigan Notable Book in 2023, and it was published by Wayne State University Press. Welcome, RS.
Thanks for having me. This is so exciting. I've been enjoying diving into the podcasts that have come out more recently, and it's just nice. I think it's great that there's a regional love for our region's stories. And I'm so excited to have you all bring me international. It's funny, like when I left the Thumb, folks would always say, "Where are you from?" I said, "I'm from a place that's 2 hours north of Canada." Because I always followed, drive to Port Huron or drive to Detroit. It was always follow the speed limit. So every time I say anything's anywhere like an hour away, people are like, "Yeah, if you drive the speed limit." I was like, and I do.
Well, thank you so much for that little bit of appreciation. We appreciate that. So that's lovely that you've been listening to the work. So, all right, you grew up as a Thumbody, as we said, and now you live in Clarksville, Tennessee.
Yeah.
Given your interest in rural-urban dynamics, what would you say are the biggest differences between the two regions, and in what ways are they the same?
Yeah. So I think that started. So I'm from Cairo, Michigan, which for all of us, that's Detroit, and then you folks are right over here, right? I'm up here, and I'm from outside of a town of 4,000 people. It's a town called Cairo, Michigan. It's a county seat of Tuscola County. And I never felt like a country kid. And then I did my MFA at Columbia College Chicago. And so I moved to Chicago in 2014. And then I was like, oh, I think I'm a little country. And I think that was like the start of like this like regional puberty, if you will. Like I grew out of one place and grew into another place and grew out of that place. So I lived in Chicago, I lived in Milwaukee. A couple of years I lived in Portland, Oregon. And I didn't feel much of a difference in places until I moved to the South. I've been here for just under 2 years now. The American South has a lot of different culture than I'm used to. Some friends I've made here have said, "Well, you're made for the South because you sure know how to talk." And I'll go to a grocery store and have a 10-minute conversation about eggs with a stranger. And folks are like, "That's the Southern experience right there." I think, Clarksville is a really unique city. It's outside, it's about an hour out of Nashville. It's Middle Tennessee. It's a mixture of college town, military town, rural. So we've got Fort Campbell, which brings in so many different people from all over the country and all over the world. We have a very large Guamanian population, Korean population. Of course, we live in the South, so we have a large African-American population. And then, of course, with the college, with Austin Peay, just a ton of rural working class people that are all continuing their education. So I haven't really, I hear all sorts of accents in Clarksville. I have started picking up saying y'all, and folks that back home have pointed that out instead of you all, or a very Midwestern one that I've worked to get out as you guys. So y'all is slowly dripping into my language. But overall, I'm looking out my window right now. We live on a river. I grew up on a river. We live on a river now, lots of woods. a ton of deer in our backyard, but we're still in the city limits. So it is this weird mix of military school, city. We also have like the school has a 450-acre farm in the town, in the city limits itself. So it's a very unique city. And yeah, so I guess if that answered your question, I don't know if it answered your question. I felt more out of place than when I was in Milwaukee. Milwaukee was an odd city for me. I was like, I think I'm tired of massive cities.
Your research interests include working class studies and rural urban dynamics. How did these areas of study impact your book?
Um, it ties right into moving to Chicago, actually. I always, so when I lived in Cairo and I was growing up, it was very much like, nope, you're going to college. I'm a first, my sister and I are first generation college students. And I'm a perfectionist. So as soon as I started college, I was like, I'm going to go all the way, and grad school will be a thing, and then I'll finish that. And it was always you're going to go to college. So in school, I hung out with the college bound kids, and yeah, they lived in town. I didn't really know what a townie was compared to, because I thought, we're all from this small town, and it was not until like 10 years later that I was like, I wasn't really from that small town. I was from the woods outside that small town. And every time I'd come into town, I was like an unsocialized puppy who just wanted to be around people. So I was always like, this is a long way of saying I was the annoying kid growing up. So another thing that I found that was different with some of the folks that I would hang out with, and this didn't come about until the Great Recession, is that we grew up working class. My family, they would say, "Oh, we're lower middle class," which I'm not going to get into all of that, but the short answer is the lower middle class isn't a thing. It don't exist. We're a paycheck, a missed paycheck, or a hospital bill, or a busted up car or a car wreck away from not having. And the Great Recession really showed that. My dad and my mom and my sister and I we were up against it, and just like millions of other Americans and people across the world as well. So when I graduated college into the fallout of the Great Recession, and I was living in attics, and I was mowing lawns of bank repossessions. And that was one of the stories that the title story, Enough to Lose, came from my time mowing the lawns of abandoned houses. And our just list got bigger and bigger. And these empty rural spaces were just desolate. And I thought a lot about that when I moved to Chicago, and I looked at the poverty in cities. And then Milwaukee is the most segregated city in the United States. And I saw the poverty was along racial lines as well. And seeing that really helped me with my studies. It really helped me with understanding whose stories deserve to be told and whose stories do get to be told a lot. In grad school, I read a ton of fiction about bored middle-class housewives or bored, disenchanted coastal white men. And I was like, these stories don't, my family isn't going to, my family, not the people I come from, they're not going to read these stories. So I really was like, I'm going to start really focusing on the thumb and rural spaces and working class people. And I flirt a little bit with Detroit and Chicago and Flint and Saginaw. So, because those worlds, I spent some time in those worlds, but I'm more firmly rooted in hyper rural spaces. So I kind of like with the dynamic, what we're getting at is I like seeing how the issues that can connect rural and urban spaces along class and racial lines, gendered lines. A lot of the working class labor is unpaid labor that women usually do. So I'm really focused on that. I'm going to read from a story here that has a mom in it who the husband is dead, and now she's like the breadwinner, and she's not prepared for that. And so I take to task a bunch of toxic masculine traits and all that. So I see that in rural spaces. I see it in urban spaces.
So for our listeners who might be in Germany, when we talk about the thumb of Michigan, we are talking about the Eastern Peninsula of Michigan and sort of making that unique. And so, how would you describe to yourself the culture of the thumb and what makes it unique or a good subject for fiction?
Yeah, that's a great question. Okay, so for everyone who's going to be watching or listening to this, you can take your right hand, and if you look at the palm of your right hand and you point to your thumb right in the middle, that's where the book exists. We call it the Thumb of Michigan because Michigan's Lower Peninsula looks like a hand, and I'm on the thumb. And one of the things that I loved about the unique space of the thumb is so the Lower Peninsula, without the Mackinac Bridge, without the Blue Water Bridge, and now the new Gordie Howe Bridge, which I've seen lots of videos of that. Without all these bridges, a peninsula is a dead end. You've got to have really good reason to want to go down a dead end. And the thumb is a peninsula on a peninsula. So it is a geographic dead end on a geographic dead end. And I'm just fascinated by like the isolation. I love quiet rural spaces. I'm a hunter myself. I like going out in the woods. I like serenity. I like all that great stuff. But also these rural spaces, people go to them to do some pretty nefarious stuff. We're an hour away from any interstate if you drive the speed limit. But Timothy McVeigh and Terry Nichols built the bombs for the Oklahoma City bombings 10 miles away from my childhood home. And that the thumb has a infamous history of anti-government white supremacy. And that's not to badmouth the place, because of course, hashtag not all thumb buddies are like that, but getting a distance from that allowed me to write it more critically, which made the writing a lot better. There are lovely, wonderful people. Some of my absolute favorite people still live there. And there are also people there that need to have some light shined on them. So one of the fascinating things that I like to write about is the thumb and the good and bad things that people get up to way out in the woods there. And also, I love a lot of other Michigan writers who don't write about the thumb. Like they're from Kalamazoo. Bonnie Jo Campbell's got the southwest of the state pretty much on lock. Matt Bell's got Detroit on lock. So's Jim Daniels. There's a history of Ernest Hemingway writing about the woods and all that stuff, but nobody really writing about the thumb. There's a poet, his name's Cal Freeman, and he writes a lot about the thumb. I've met him now. He's from Dearborn. And Cal, if he's listening to this, stay off my territory. I'm kidding. He writes lovely work.
Okay. Well, okay. The book starts with a disaster story set in the Great Flood of 1986. Do you remember that event personally, and what kind of stories or mythology about the flood developed in that region in later years?
I was not even on the plans for my parents yet. My mom was pregnant with my sister, Janelle. Hello, Janelle. So what really got me there, so the 1986 flood really did happen, and it was something that was always in the background of conversations at diners or whatever. It was like, oh, and it also had a really close family story related to us. A great family friend, one of the aforementioned most lovely people that live in the Thumb. My parents had moved to that house on the river. I think it was in 1980. They're going to hate me for this. No, they got married in 82. I think they moved up in 1985. And in 1986, they were still doing some renovations on the house, and the river flooded. And they had bought a bunch of sandbags. They were filling a lot of sandbags, and they didn't know what was going to happen. And this guy showed up, and his name's Tim. And he said, "We're getting you folks out of here. I got a pole barn. You're going to stay here." They never met this guy before. And he's been a family friend ever since. My first job was working for him. He owns a pet store in Caro. And he's just him, and I lived with his son. I actually officiated his son's wedding this past December. Family friends, perfect with that. But I thought to myself, what if that story hadn't gone right? What if the opposite had happened? And that's like the joy of fiction, is we can go back to these really impactful stories, and we get to use them as a locust for what ifs. And I think that starting the book with that story just shows that, this isolated space is isolated on some ways, but they're also impacted by the world around them. They can't stop nature. They can't stop. A lot of other stories deal with cell phone towers coming in, wind turbines coming in, high-speed internet coming in, the whole world just creeping into this very wannabe isolated space. So I thought starting with nature, like you can't stop nature. So let's start with that.
So another recurring symbol in the book is Bucky's Bridge, named after a suicide. What attracted you to the bridge as an image, and how do you think it connects to your characters or their lives?
I guess if we can get into like a metaphor of bridges, I'm always fascinated by like bridging cultures and bridging societies and everything. The short answer is my family grew up on a river, and at the end of our driveway was a bridge, and I never was told not to. No, I think I was told not to go underneath the bridge as a kid because like there's a river there and we don't want you falling in. But you know, a bunch of shenanigans I would canoe that river and kayak that river, and there's always graffiti. There was always you know, certain high school history teacher nobody liked or whatever. You know, there's got expletives or whatever. I just loved this bridge. I loved the image of it. I just thought, you know, it echoes. It's such a quiet road. And it was dirt for the longest time. So when you only heard a car if it was on this bridge echoing up and down the river. So it kind of was like a reminder that people exist out in the world, especially way out where we were. Now the road is paved. It's a pretty busy north-south thoroughfare. I think that the bridge I would see families fishing off of it. If you were kayaking or canoeing, people would wave down to you. So it was kind of this sense of community. But really out there in the woods, it's the only like man-made landmark. And I was just really fascinated by nature and industry kind of mixing up a little bit. And then the story that starts with a suicide, I just, you know, that we come back to that bridge a lot in the story, because it allows us to go places. Like this bridge allows us to get from one side of the river to the other, but it also allows a type of escape for a lot of the characters who economically, culturally, artistically cannot find an escape in this area. So just thought a bridge would be a good image for that. I wasn't ready for that question. That was a good one. I don't know, there's a bridge, but yeah, it does a lot more.
The title story, Enough to Lose, is set just after the crash of 2008. And it's about a young man mowing lawns for a living while his wife sells diet aids. He's trying to decide if he wants to start a family, and he's fascinated by a guy who's squatting in the house he lost in the economic crash. How did you see the choice in front of the young lawnmower kid, and why do you think he made the choice that he did?
A lot went into that. And so that was the first story that I really started thinking about. It was 2012, summer 2012. I was living in an attic in Bay City, Michigan, and I would drive way out into the Thumb early in the morning to get on this crew to mow these bank repossessions. And up to 17 hours a day, we were just mowing lawns, and it was a great paycheck, but oh goodness, you had to make it work. We're driving this really crappy F-150, and I'd never driven a zero-turn mower before. And I just had this job, and the first day I worked, the guy didn't stop for lunch. He didn't even eat anything. It was just coffee and cigarettes. And because an hour lunch is 2 lawns, and that's $20 in his pocket. So I thought a lot about that. And I was 23 or 24 at the time. So 27 seemed like somebody who would have their life together, an older 20-year-old. And a thing for me was, it's been asked of me for most of my life when I'm going to have kids, because as the only male Deeren in the family of child make and age, we have the sticky patriarchy where I've got to create a son to keep the name going. And so I've always had that pressure in my life. And I'm 35 right now and still don't have kids. And I thought about that with this character. The character's name is Tim, and Tim feels the pressure. I think he's a little bit more amenable to it now that he's seen what he sees throughout this story. He really realizes that he might not have what his plan is, but he's definitely got a lot. And he's a little more secure than he thinks he is.
Taking a look at the story called The Run, you also explore the tension between the people who stay in the thumb and sort of their feelings around the people who leave, and most of them do stay gone, but a couple come back for visits or whatever. People often choose to leave rural areas, but why do you think some choose to stay?
I think some choose to stay because of family. There's so many other reasons. I think the most honorable reasons is family. I've always said that it's a really good place to come from. Like Caro and the Thumb area, it's a really good place to come from. Like, and if you can make it work there, you can. More times than not, the people who can make a good go there are from families that have already made a good go there. And my family, my mom and dad moved up there. They're not from there. They're downriver Detroit folks, and that's where most of my family still lives. But they moved up there for a job, and dad loves hunting, and they stayed. So I don't have family ties in Caro other than mom and dad. So I don't have the generational connection that other folks have. Like, my family's name is not going to be on a street sign, but I went to school with families who's named after their streets named after them. And for me also, and a lot of millennials as well, it was the push to go to college. You've got to go to college. You don't want to be flipping burgers as if that was the worst thing to do, right? You want to get educated and get a good job. So I went to college, and I thought I wanted to be a high school history teacher, and that's what I went to school for. And then writing took over, and I wanted to, maybe I was a substitute teacher for a little bit, and I didn't really like walking into a high school. I didn't like the feel of it anymore. So I pushed to go to college and grad school and become a college professor. And that's one of the reasons why I didn't go back. But sometimes people stay because it's scary. It's scary to leave what you've already known, what you've always known, especially if you don't have a lot. And I was at leave-in age when the Great Recession happened. So a lot of people stayed because they didn't have the means to leave. And some of them are still there, and some of them are gone. Meth, opioids, and heroin are still a big issue in rural spaces. And we're seeing state governments suing large pharmaceutical companies and winning almost billions of dollars, and because of what's going on. So I think about that a lot as well. But on a brighter note, most people who do stay, they have a lot of good family support, and they make a rich life for themselves. And I applaud that.
That's awesome. So what are you writing now? Do you have time to do any more writing?
Yeah, well, so I am in a really nice position where I get to teach. I love teaching, so I take notes a lot. During my creative writing classes, the students have plenty of time to write. So I sneak in writing during that. I like to mirror to them, this is what this exercise looks like, and this is all the cool stuff you can do with it afterwards. So it's usually a compilation of like half a notebook filled with notes. And then the summertime comes, and I just write because the students, my partner works from home. I'm actually at her desk right now, and I have an office on campus. We're only 10 minutes from campus, and there's no students there during the summer. So this last summer, I was there every day, 9 to 5, and I wrote. I'm in a really lucky position after all this work, and I have those months to just write. My agent right now just giving me back notes on a novel called The Recessionists. That's a working title, and it follows a family, an ex-husband and ex-wife and their teenage son as they navigate the years from the Great Recession to the pandemic and that recession. So it's following that. It's kind of follows the dad is a formerly incarcerated, moves back to Caro, and realizes that in a real small town, your story gets bigger and bigger and bigger, and it gets harder and harder to live, especially if one of the guys who's got your number is the chief of police.
All right. Would you like to read from some of your work for our audience?
Yeah, sure. I can do that. So I'm going to read from Her Guts and All, which is a middle part of the book. So just I'm going to read from the middle of the story. For those of you who are going to eventually read the book, this one it follows a teenage boy. His father has just passed away, and they're sustenance hunters. And their rich neighbor has created an agreement, and all the other landowners have created an agreement that we aren't going to harvest any deer unless they're massive bucks. We're just trophy hunting from now on, and that puts this poor family in a bind. So he has just shot the deer, and it has run onto his rich neighbor's land across the river. Get moving, he told himself. Move your feet. He said it in a way he'd remember his father saying it, urgent but playful, as if he were happy to have a son to inconvenience him from time to time. He took in the trees one last time, and then he went. He kept low and moved slowly to the body. He could grab her by the hind legs, drag her to the trees, and field dress her by the river. He'd be able to kick her insides into the water, and they'd be gone. The snow would cover his tracks and any remaining blood. Nobody would know he'd been on the property. Nobody would know he'd broken the agreement. From behind the log pile, the field had looked like a slab of uneven concrete, but McKinnon sank in mud with each step. He was ankle deep when he came up next to the body. His footprints dotted the snow behind him like brown exclamation points, signaling his arrival. She was bigger than he'd thought she'd be. It was something that his father said never happened. They all look big between the sights, but not up close, he remembered him saying. McKinnon assumed this doe would be around 120 pounds. But this time, McKinnon's father's advice had been wrong, and the doe at his feet was easily 50 or 60 pounds larger. In fact, it was one of the largest deer the boy had ever shot. He bent over the body and placed a hand on her side. She was barely warm and had collapsed with the bullet's exit wound facing up. He ran his hands up to her shoulder, the fur ruffling and falling back into place. A shotgun blast called across the field and sent McKinnon belly down into the mud beside the doe. It had happened, he thought. His neighbor had spotted him and was going to see to it that the punk kid next door learned a lesson impossible to forget. A second shot followed, but now that McKinnon had an ear to the distance, he realized that it was farther up the field, closer to the front of his neighbor's land. Peeking over the body, he saw half a dozen deer running back toward the river. They were 100 yards away, out of any sensible person's range. That settled him. The snow was starting to accumulate on the doe's carcass. It was after 4, and the daylight wouldn't last much longer. McKinnon knew whoever had shot would be eager to get their trophy. About 70 yards up, a patch of orange came through the trees. It had to be his neighbor. Nobody else was with him. The hunter moved quickly in the opposite direction of McKinnon. There was every chance that they'd seen him, but the figure didn't look back as it followed the trajectory of the deer. As soon as the hunter hit the trees, McKinnon was on his feet, tugging the doe's hind legs. The mud hadn't frozen, not even close, and he couldn't get a solid footing between where he'd been and where he wanted to be. He dragged the doe, stopping every few yards to catch his breath and readjust the load. The bright side, he told himself, was that he'd be able to stretch the meat of a deer this size for weeks. And despite the trees and the river, he was less than 100 yards from home. McKinnon got to the log pile and dropped the carcass behind it. He needed to rest, to gather his wits. The last thing he, or his mother for that matter, wanted was for him to be too tired to get across the river. The current had taken a handful of lives in its day. McKinnon did not want to become another. He grabbed a log from the pile, dusted the snow off, and used it for a chair. He laughed. He was going to pull it off. His neighbor could talk all he wanted, a big man walking into folks' homes thinking he had something to say worth hearing and thinking he'd be able to enforce whatever nonsense he spouted. Rich folks, McKinnon thought. They could get like that when there were people like him and his mother around to boss. He had been raised in a world like that, and he especially knew it to be true in Cairo, where land was worth more on the high side of the river, where those who had less could only afford to live where nature threatened to kill them during every spring thaw. Screw my neighbor, McKinnon thought. What better way to make him shove it than to not only survive, but to get away with living? I'll stop there.
RS Deeren, thank you very much for joining us today.
This was lovely. It was so great to talk to you all. It was so great to talk to you all.
Well, thank you again. And the book is Enough to Lose and is published by Wayne State University Press.
Thank you so much, everybody.
Thanks for joining us. Look for more episodes of All Right in Sin City wherever you listen to podcasts, or check out our website, allrightinsincity.com. For information and announcements of new podcasts, sign up to our email list or follow us on Facebook and Twitter.